How cocaine fueled Nazi Germany. Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to the 1930s. So go ahead and dim the lights, maybe fluff your pillow, and get comfortable. Because tonight's story isn't about heroes or villains. Not really. It's about stimulants, specifically, how one of the most destructive regimes in human history was, for quite a while, humming along on cocaine. Yes, the Third Reich, fueled not just by rage, propaganda, and goose-stepping, but by a nation-sized drug problem. It's not the part they put in the textbooks, which is a shame, really, because once you learn it, a lot of things start making unsettling sense. Let's begin quietly. Somewhere between delusion and exhaustion, a familiar place. If you've ever pulled an all-nighter and convinced yourself that reorganizing your sock drawer at 3 a.m. was an act of destiny. Germany, 1933. The sleepless nation. When Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, Germany wasn't exactly thriving. The economy was wrecked, the people were bitter, and the country was emotionally hungover from World War I. And just like any sleepless person trying to power through, the new Reich decided it needed a pick-me-up. Enter Pervitin, a charming little pill that, at the time, was being marketed to housewives as a way to make more energetic sandwiches. It was methamphetamine, pure crystalline meth. You could buy it over the counter, like aspirin. You could give it to your mother-in-law, your postal worker, your toddler if you were feeling ambitious. People loved it. It made you feel invincible, focused, capable of reorganizing the entire German state in a weekend. And so, naturally, that's exactly what they did. The miracle drug nobody should have had by 1938, Pervitin, was everywhere. The company that made it, Temmler Werke, advertised it with cheerful slogans: alertness, confidence, freshness. They were not wrong. Letters from soldiers and civilians described it as a small miracle. University students popped it before exams. Secretaries took it to work longer hours. And Hitler's staff, well, they noticed how much he liked a certain doctor's injections. But we'll get to that. Slowly. For now, picture the German army gearing up for war. The generals are anxious. The logistics are impossible. And the plan for conquering Europe depends on a thing called blitzkrieg. Literally, lightning war. Fast, furious, and unstoppable. Which, if you've ever stayed up for 72 hours on amphetamines, might sound familiar? Caffeinated tank divisions, the first campaigns of World War II. Were astonishingly fast. Poland in weeks, France in days. Historians long credited brilliant strategy, superior organization, and sheer arrogance. But when military doctors later looked at supply logs, they found something else. Millions of Pervitin pills distributed to soldiers. Yes, millions. The average German soldier in 1940 was essentially a caffeinated skeleton in a steel helmet. There are reports of tank crews staying awake for 3 days straight, hallucinating, euphoric, and somehow still operating heavy machinery. One report described a unit that, after 48 sleepless hours, began seeing enemy horses that weren't there. Another soldier wrote that he felt completely one with the machine, which, depending on your taste in techno music, is either spiritual enlightenment or catastrophic psychosis. But in Berlin, it all looked magnificent. See? The generals said. The meth works. Dr. Theodor Morell, the world's worst doctor. Let's drift now to the heart of this story. Hitler's personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, a man who, even by 1930s standards, was moist. He was known for his greasy skin, his strange body odor, and his unwavering confidence that any problem could be solved with an injection. When Hitler met him in 1936, he was suffering from stomach cramps, insomnia, and various stress-induced ailments. Morell, ever the salesman, gave him a shot of Vitamultin, a blend of vitamins, glucose, and just a pinch of something interesting. Hitler felt great within hours. Naturally, he kept seeing Morell. Every morning, every evening. For years, the Führer's daily injections eventually included not just vitamins, but Eucadol, a form of oxycodone, cocaine eye drops, and methamphetamine-based tonics. Morell kept meticulous records, which read less like medical notes and more like the world's worst smoothie recipe. It's easy to imagine Hitler in his bunker, jittering, pacing, lecturing his generals at 4 a.m., and insisting the war was still winnable. He wasn't possessed by a demon, as propaganda liked to claim. He was just extremely high. Tree 2, leadership high meth didn't just infect the soldiers, it climbed the chain of command like ivy. Field marshals used it to push through long operations. Tauteridans used it to stay alert on endless missions. Even secretaries and messengers were dosed, because apparently the paperwork for world domination is exhausting. The Reich became an empire of sleepless people, trembling, confident, slightly paranoid. They truly believed they could take on the entire world. And for a terrifying moment, it almost looked like they could, until, of course, they couldn't. Crashes, collapses, and breakdowns by 1942. The cracks started to show. Addiction, psychosis, and sudden collapses spread. Through the ranks, doctors began reporting. Soldiers who could no longer feel fear, followed by soldiers who could no longer feel anything. Entire divisions would fight for 48 hours, then sleep for 24. Mid-battle. Morell's patient, the one in the bunker, wasn't doing much better. Hitler's health declined rapidly. He developed tremors, skin sores, and digestive failure. His mood swung between manic euphoria and catatonic despair. Still, Morell continued the injections, proudly noting each new cocktail. At one point, Hitler was receiving over 70 medications simultaneously, including amphetamines, opioids, and barbiturates. The man had become a pharmacy with legs. When Allied doctors later reviewed the evidence, they realized the war had, quite literally, been run by addicts. Continent on meth. The irony of purity. There's something darkly poetic about a regime obsessed with racial purity. While its leadership was pharmacologically polluted, they preached about discipline, strength, and the superiority of the human body, while chemically sustaining themselves with narcotics and lies. You almost have to admire the contradiction. Almost. And of course, like all addictions, it didn't end with clarity or redemption. It ended with collapse, the same way every stimulant binge does, in paranoia, isolation, and exhaustion. Hitler fired Morell near the very end, accusing him of poisoning him which, in fairness, wasn't entirely wrong, and as the bunker fell silent in 1945, Germany began to detox from its long, national-high aftermath and quiet withdrawal. When the Allies occupied Germany, they found warehouses stacked with Pervitin, millions of tablets that had fueled the Blitz. Doctors and soldiers were still hooked. For years, black market meth circulated among veterans and civilians. The company that made it quietly rebranded. Temler survived the war, went back to making legitimate pharmaceuticals, and pretended that the whole meth thing had just been a quirky marketing phase. Germany, meanwhile, entered a collective withdrawal, physical, political, emotional. The miracle pills were gone. The euphoria had faded, and the hangover was brutal. The long, slow come-down if you zoom out. And it's better to do that from a safe, drowsy distance. The story of Nazi Germany's one. Addiction is a strangely human one, a nation desperate to feel powerful, a leader terrified of weakness. Society that thought sleeplessness was strength. They burned themselves out on chemicals and dreams of greatness, and when the drugs stopped working, the illusion did too. You can almost hear it. The silence after the frenzy. The empty bottles, the broken syringes, the snoring of exhausted soldiers finally allowed to sleep. A gentle drift to irony. And so, as you drift tonight, safe, calm, blissfully unimportant in the grand scheme of history, you can think about this. The mighty empire that tried to rule the world was undone by the same thing that ruins all-nighters: biology. Because eventually, every system crashes, even one running on methamphetamine, and maybe, just maybe, there's comfort in that. That even history's worst monsters had to take naps eventually. Now, let's drift to the next chapter. A gentler tragedy, but no less absurd. We'll visit the gilded palaces of Europe's most inbred dynasties, where love, as it turns out, was a family affair. Earlier monarchs weren't much different. Medieval queens sprinkled their floors with petals, burned herbs in brass braziers, and perfumed their gloves to keep unpleasant court smells at bay. When greeting guests, a waft of violet or musk was as deliberate a signal as a jeweled crown. It said, "I am pure, I am powerful, and I can afford roses in January." A different kind of clean, so yes. People in the Middle Ages smelled, but they didn't smell dirty to themselves. They smelled like their world, like bread ovens and sweat, incense and hay, soap made from animal fat, and hair washed in rosemary water. It was a bouquet of everything they touched, ate, burned, and believed. It was about balance, about smelling appropriate for your station, your gender, and your moral character. The goal wasn't to erase the body. It was to live within it and make peace with whatever came off it. Let's drift forward a little into Part 2, where we'll explore how these invisible families quietly shaped the empire's frontiers, how Roman citizenship trickled through generations of unofficial children, and how love, law, and logistics collided in the world's largest military machine. What did people do with mummies in the Renaissance? The fashionable dead? Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a time when Europe rediscovered the glories of the ancient world and immediately started grinding them up for medicine. It's the Renaissance, that dazzling, painterly age of genius, invention, and questionable hygiene. Michelangelo was chiseling marble. Galileo was pointing lenses at the stars, and somewhere an apothecary was scraping the remains of an Egyptian mummy into a bowl and calling it science. Because, yes, for several centuries, Europeans genuinely believed that powdered mummy was a kind of miracle drug. It was taken for headaches, for gout, for stomach cramps, and for the vague existential ennui of being alive in the 16th century. It was also used in paint, in cosmetics, and occasionally as a party centerpiece. So, let's settle in, dim the lights, take a breath, and drift with me into one of history's stranger cultural fads. A time when the line between medicine, art, and grave robbing was politely ignored. From tomb to table. The birth of mumia. It all began, as so many Renaissance trends did, with a misunderstanding. In the early Middle Ages, traders brought a black, tarry substance called mumia from the Middle East. It was bitumen, natural asphalt, which people believed had healing properties. It smelled medicinal, it was exotic, and therefore it must be good for you. But somewhere along the Silk Road, someone made an expensive mistake. They confused mumia, the asphalt, with mummies, the desiccated bodies, and so the word changed meaning, as words often do when there's profit involved. By the 13th century, European apothecaries were advertising mumia vera, true mummy, which meant, yes, this powder came from an actual Egyptian corpse. Because, of course, the real thing had to work better. Doctors prescribed it for internal bleeding, broken bones, epilepsy, plague, and occasionally heartbreak. If you had a headache, you might be told to take a spoonful of ground-up farro with wine, and if that didn't help, well, at least you'd have an interesting story to tell your priest. The mummy trade. Business is booming. By the time of the Renaissance, mummy powder had become a booming industry. Merchants in Cairo and Alexandria discovered that Europeans would pay extraordinary sums for ancient remains, preferably ones with plenty of bitumen still clinging to the skin. So, enterprising locals began raiding tombs, temples, and burial sites by the thousands. The 8 great necropolises of Thebes and Saqqara became open-air supply chains for European pharmacies. Bodies that had rested peacefully for 3,000 years were being crated up and shipped down the Nile for resale. Naturally, the supply of genuine mummies couldn't keep up with the demand. So, merchants got creative. They began making fake mummies, contemporary corpses smeared with resin, wrapped in old linen, and sold as authentic antiquities. No one in Europe could tell the difference. And honestly, no one seemed to care. One 16th-century merchant bragged that he could mummify a body in a few days if business was slow. He was, in effect, the world's first mummy counterfeiter, and business, as they say, was brisk. Apothecaries of the dead step inside a Renaissance apothecary, and you'd find jars of dried herbs, vials of mercury, powdered unicorn horn, which was usually narwhal tusk, and, proudly on display, little lumps of brownish-black resin labeled mumia. The smell was said to be faintly sweet, like earth after rain, or like tar mixed with cinnamon. People mixed it into wine, ale, or honey. Physicians swore by it, and the higher your social status, the more likely you were to have a private stash in your cabinet of curiosities. In 1564, the famous physician Ambroise Paré, who had actually performed surgery instead of praying over wounds, which was considered radical, publicly denounced mummy powder as nonsense. He called it a thing neither holy nor wholesome. But even he admitted that, occasionally, he had to prescribe it, because patients demanded it. Mummy, in other words, was the 16th century equivalent of a wellness trend. Everyone knew it was ridiculous, but everyone bought it anyway. The medicinal logic of cannibalism. The use of mummy powder wasn't considered morbid, at least not by Renaissance standards. People believed in something called sympathetic medicine. The idea was simple. If you consumed the essence of something strong, you would become strong. If you ate the heart of a lion, you gained courage. If you ate part of a man who had served death, well, immortality might rub off a little. There's an uncomfortable truth here. European medicine during the Renaissance was quietly cannibalistic. Not only mummy powder, but blood, fat, and bone were all ingredients in legitimate medical recipes. Doctors prescribed human fat for gout, human skull powder for epilepsy, and fresh blood, yes, still warm, for melancholy. It sounds horrific now, but it wasn't seen that way then. It was just part of the strange, porous border between medicine and superstition. Mummy powder was convenient because it offered all the supposed power of the human body without the awkwardness of finding a freshly executed criminal. And, of course, it came with the alluring fragrance of ancient Egypt, a civilization everyone admired, even as they pillaged it. Mummy parties and drawing rooms by the 17th century, mummies had become fashionable beyond medicine. The wealthy began collecting them as conversation pieces. Aristocrats in France and England bought entire coffins, sarcophagi, and wrapped bodies to display in their private galleries. Visitors would sip wine and admire the craftsmanship, while servants discreetly brushed centuries of dust off the linen. Sometimes these displays turned into performances. A host would announce that the evening's entertainment was the unwrapping of a real Egyptian mummy. Guests would gather, silk sleeves fluttering, as the linen came away layer by layer. There might even be refreshments, because nothing complements the slow unveiling of a corpse like a plate of sugared almonds. In London, the practice continued into the 19th century. Mummy unwrappings became ticketed events, part scientific demonstration, part morbid theater. But the Renaissance laid the groundwork. It was the age when Egypt stopped being sacred and started being collectible. Mummies in paint, the color of antiquity. There's another, quieter way the Renaissance consumed mummies, through art, painters, especially those working with oils, loved the deep, rich brown pigment known as mummy brown. It was smooth, transparent, and perfect for shading flesh tones or adding warmth to a canvas. And yes, it was made from the ground remains of human mummies, mixed with oils and resin. It was expensive, which only made it more desirable. Artists boasted of using authentic Egyptian brown, and some even complained, when the quality dropped, as if their supplier had used the wrong dynasty. 16. Pre-Raphaelite artist Edward Burne-Jones supposedly stopped using it when he learned what was actually in it. He took the remaining paint, held a small funeral for it in his garden, and buried it respectfully, which is probably the kindest treatment a mummy ever received after arriving in Europe. The great irony, consuming immortality, it's hard not to admire the absurdity of it all. Europeans believed that the ancients had mastered the art of preserving life, and so they consumed the evidence. Egyptians had gone to extraordinary lengths to preserve their dead. They dried them, wrapped them, sealed them in tombs with amulets and prayers for eternal life. And then, centuries later, someone in Venice decided that the best use for that effort was to sprinkle it on toast. There's something deeply Renaissance about that logic. Reverence mixed with appetite. They adored the ancient world, but couldn't quite resist taking it apart to see how it worked. The church looks the other way. You might think the church would have objected. Technically, consuming human remains should have raised eyebrows, but mummy powder was so common and so lucrative that moral objections were minimal. The papacy issued no firm bans. Doctors and bishops alike kept jars of mumia in their studies. And since the bodies were pagan, they were conveniently outside the reach of Christian burial laws. Theologians found that loophole extremely helpful. Besides, there was a comforting logic to it. If Christ's body and blood could heal souls, perhaps the body of an ancient could heal the flesh. The Renaissance loved symbolism, especially when it came with a profit margin. But these matches were rarely glamorous. A disgraced daughter might be married off to a loyal but low-ranking knight, ensuring her descendants would never again pose a threat. A surviving son might wed an heiress chosen by the crown, a way to fold his family's remnants back into safer hands. Every now and then, though, this strategy backfired spectacularly, because sometimes those quiet, forgotten children grew up and remembered who they were. But that's something we'll drift into next time. The comeback stories, the near rebellions, and the ones who somehow turned disgrace into destiny. For now, let's pause here in the stillness, among convent walls and confiscated castles, where noble children learned the hardest royal lesson of all, that survival, in the end, was its own kind of rebellion. Let's drift now, from the apothecary's counter to the royal court. Because, of course, it wasn't just physicians and merchants buying this powdered antiquity. Kings and queens got involved too. And, naturally, they made it worse. How did executioners actually live? The men nobody wanted to touch. Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a world that smelled faintly of wood smoke, candle grease, and iron. You've probably heard of knights, kings, and peasants, but there's one group you rarely hear about. They were necessary, well paid, and utterly despised. The people everyone wanted around, but never too close. Tonight, we're talking about the executioners, the men who cleaned up after royal justice, who lived on the edge of every city, carrying the strange mixture of fear and fascination that followed them everywhere they went. So, if you're lying in bed, maybe already half drifting off, don't worry. This won't be gruesome. No screaming crowds or gory details. Just a slow walk through the odd, isolated lives of the people who held the sword, swung the axe, and somehow still had to pay rent. The most unpopular job in Europe, it's hard to overstate how disliked executioners were. In medieval and early modern Europe, death was public business. Executions weren't done behind closed doors. They were a community event, and someone had to do the practical part. That person, the hangman, the headsman, or sometimes just the man with the rope, was both feared and essential. The city couldn't function without him. But nobody wanted to speak to him, touch him, or marry into his family. People would cross the street to avoid brushing against an executioner's cloak. Children were told that if they misbehaved, the hangman would come for them. And yet, if a thief needed to be punished, or a noble needed his head taken off neatly, everyone suddenly remembered his address. It's the kind of social paradox that only the Middle Ages could maintain, publicly despising someone you privately relied on. Born into the blade many, executioners didn't actually choose the job. It was hereditary, passed down like a family heirloom, that nobody wanted. In Nuremberg, Augsburg, or Paris, If your father was the city's headsman, congratulations. You were too. The title stuck to you. If you tried to leave town and start a new life, word would spread, and other towns wouldn't accept you. It's said that the children of executioners often played only with each other, partly by choice, mostly by necessity. Their homes sat on the outskirts of town, near the gallows or the slaughterhouse, a grim sort of zoning law. But there was an odd advantage. Because executioners were isolated, they could bend the rules of respectability. They were allowed to gamble, keep taverns, and interact with criminals, things a decent citizen couldn't do. It was social exile, with loose regulations. A day at work, an executioner's duties were broader than you'd think. They didn't just kill people. They also acted as public torturers, interrogators, and, oddly enough, health inspectors. When the plague rolled through town, the executioner might be called to remove the bodies. When an animal went mad, he was asked to put it down. And when no one else wanted to handle something messy, like disposing of waste or cleaning blood from the streets, the city council quietly sent for him. In short, he was both sanitation worker and symbol of divine justice. A deeply contradictory resume. Most cities kept the role in the family for generations because no one else wanted it. Some families became almost professional dynasties, skilled, discreet, and reliable. The most famous were the Sansons of France, who served as royal executioners for 6 generations. That's about 200 years of job security, which in medieval terms is practically eternity. The salary of sin. Here's the odd part. Executioners were well paid. Cities understood that if you wanted someone to handle the dirty work, you had to compensate them for the social disgust that came with it. In 16th century Germany, a skilled executioner could earn more than a mid-level merchant. They were paid per job, a few thalers for a hanging, a bit more for a beheading, and sometimes extra for special services. They also got perks. Every criminal executed left behind possessions, clothing, shoes, sometimes money. The executioner got first pick. If you were clever, you could build a small fortune from other people's bad decisions. In France, the Sansons even received an annual stipend from the crown, plus a uniform allowance. Nothing says official recognition, being paid to buy new black gloves. But there was always a catch. Money couldn't buy respect. No matter how rich an executioner became, he was still seen as tainted. A man who lived in moral quarantine. The problem of touch, to touch an executioner, was considered unlucky. To shake his hand, almost unthinkable. At church, people avoided sitting near them. In taverns, landlords placed their mugs separately. Even their wives, if they could find any, came from equally marginalized families, tanners, grave diggers, knackers. In some places, executioners were legally forbidden to live inside the city walls. They had their own wells, their own markets, even their own barbers. The irony, of course, was that they were some of the most hygienic people around. Executioners were required to be healthy, steady-handed, sober, and well-trained. After all, a bad swing was a public embarrassment, and nobody wanted an unprofessional beheading. The doctor of last resort. Now, here's where things get strange. Executioners, despite their grim trade, were often skilled in medicine. They understood anatomy intimately. They knew where arteries lay, how joints worked, and what could kill or heal a body. And because ordinary doctors were expensive, desperate townsfolk sometimes went to the hangman for help. He could set bones, mix salves, or drain infections. In many German towns, the executioner doubled as the local healer. Imagine it. You twist your ankle, limp to the edge of town, and the man who just yesterday hanged your neighbor now gently wraps your leg with linen. All very practical, very medieval. Some executioners even became famous for it. Franz Schmidt of Nuremberg, one of the best documented executioners in history, kept a detailed diary of every person he punished and every patient he healed. Over 40 years, he executed 394 people and treated about 15,000. His handwriting was neat, his tone was calm, and he genuinely saw himself as a servant of justice and mercy, just in alternating shifts. Family, life in exile. So what was it like to live as an executioner? Quiet, mostly. Lonely. Their homes were often near the gallows field, tidy, well-kept, and surrounded by gardens. They raised livestock, grew vegetables, and occasionally hosted the city's less reputable visitors. Their children rarely married outside the profession. When they did, it required a special license from the town council. Marrying an executioner's daughter could technically lower your social status, not something your average medieval guildsman was eager to risk. Still, there were exceptions. Some families gradually cleaned up their reputations, buying property and blending into local society. But the stain lingered for generations. Even grandchildren were sometimes labeled descendants of the hangman. The uniform of justice, you might imagine executioners in black hoods. But that's mostly a later invention. A bit of theatrical flair from the 18th and 19th centuries. Earlier headsmen dressed more practically. Leather aprons, work gloves, and sturdy boots. They often wore red, the color of both authority and, well, camouflage. During formal executions, they sometimes carried swords of remarkable craftsmanship. Many of these still survive, beautifully engraved with biblical verses or moral warnings. It's a strange combination. deadly tools designed with almost tender artistry. One famous blade used in Bavaria bore the inscription, "When I raise this sword, I wish the sinner everlasting life." That was the executioner's creed in a nutshell. Grim work, done with bureaucratic piety. Between sin and salvation, for all their social stigma, executioners were seen as spiritually necessary. They enacted divine justice so others didn't have to. Priests sometimes blessed them before major executions, reminding them that their work, though bloody, served God's order. It was an uneasy moral balance. They were both condemned and sanctified, a human contradiction walking in leather boots, and perhaps that's why so many executioners developed a peculiar calmness, a quiet professionalism that historians now find oddly modern. They didn't rant or moralize. They simply did their jobs cleanly, efficiently, and without pleasure. Because the worst sin for an executioner wasn't to fail. It was to enjoy it. That would make him monstrous. And so, in an odd way, restraint became their redemption. Let's drift forward a little, to the Age of Enlightenment, when reason was fashionable, wigs were enormous, and public executions were still the best show in town. That's where we'll pick up next, with the long, uneasy career of the Sanson family, who turned execution into a hereditary office under the kings of France, and found themselves still swinging swords when the revolution came for their masters. But for now, take a slow breath, because history's most desperate meals aren't about what people ate. They're about what they refused to stop being, even when the world gave them nothing, and while no one could describe it scientifically yet, everyone understood it emotionally. They might not have had words for bacteria, but they definitely had words for "you stink." Because history, like bloodlines, has a way of looping back on itself. And every now and then, the forgotten child of a king ends up wearing the crown centuries later. The quiet days of the hangman hay everyone tonight. We're drifting back to the Middle Ages, to a place where the air smelled faintly of wood smoke, damp wool, and bad decisions. You've probably heard plenty about medieval executioners, the grim men with hoods, axes, and unnervingly steady hands. But here's the thing. They didn't actually spend most of their time chopping off heads. In fact, many of them could go weeks, even months, without anyone officially needing to die. Which raises a surprisingly peaceful question. What did the hangman do all day when no one was scheduled to hang? You can get comfortable for this one. The story moves slowly, like an old cart creaking over cobblestones. Let's begin in a quiet corner of 15th century Germany. Say, Nuremberg, or maybe Bamberg. The kind of place where every street smells faintly of beer and anxiety. In these towns, the Scharfrichter, that's the official German word for executioner, had one of the strangest careers in all of Christendom. Their job was necessary, but not exactly respectable. They lived in a strange social purgatory, paid by the city, employed by the law, yet treated like they personally invented sin, and when they weren't called to slice off heads or burn thieves, they still had to do something. Cities didn't like paying people to just sit around sharpening things ominously. So, the medieval executioner had a side hustle. The side jobs of death professionals, it turns out, executioners were the ultimate gig workers. They did the jobs no one else wanted to touch. Quite literally. Their most common sideline? Garbage disposal. Cities often made the executioner responsible for cleaning animal carcasses, street refuse, and whatever horrifying fluids medieval cities tended to accumulate if a horse died in the middle of town. And they frequently did. Someone had to drag it out before it became a sort of horse-shaped soup that someone was, usually the hangman. They were also expected to clear corpses from rivers, bury plague victims, and occasionally disinfect wells, using medieval science, which, of course, involved pouring things that smelled worse than the problem. So, yes, the man who once chopped off a thief's hand might spend the next day scraping muck off a bridge. Because life is balance. Executioners were also required to act as unofficial veterinarians. If your cow got sick, and you didn't want to call a priest or couldn't afford a doctor, you called the hangman. They had a knack for anatomy, after all, and while you might not trust them to heal you, you'd trust them to fix a goat. Some executioners became oddly respected for their healing skills. In fact, a few even ran small apothecaries out of their homes, selling herbs, salves, and occasionally questionable potions labeled things like powder of human skull. It was, unfortunately, exactly what it sounds like. There's a nice irony here. The man trained to end lives also spent much of his time trying to prolong them, though perhaps not always successfully. The hangman's house now. Let's talk about where they lived. Executioners were usually required to reside outside the city walls. Not too far, of course. You needed them close enough for emergencies, like a surprise treason or a sudden confession, but far enough that no one's property value would be affected. Their houses were often next to cemeteries, tanneries, or leper colonies, the medieval equivalent of living beside a landfill that sometimes screams. In some German towns, their quarters were known as the hangman's tower, a small, stone residence with one purpose, to contain the socially contagious. Because people believed that working with death made you ritually unclean, like you might bring bad luck, or worse, smell like mortality. Even the hangman's family carried the stigma. Their children couldn't easily marry outside the executioner. Clan? Their wives often came from similar outcast backgrounds. Daughters of gravediggers, butchers, or other tainted professions. entire dynasties of executioners developed, passed down from father to son, like a family recipe no one wanted to inherit. Waiting for work between executions, days stretched on in dull, lonely routines. The hangman might patrol the city outskirts, keep the gallows in working order, or tend to his garden. Because, yes, the man who decapitated criminals also had to grow his own cabbage. He was expected to maintain his tools. The sword, the axe, the ropes, each had to be oiled, sharpened, and clean. Rust was unprofessional, and because executioners were occasionally summoned at a moment's notice, like medieval firefighters with much darker calls, they couldn't travel far. Their world was small, fenced in by social disgust and municipal responsibility. Sometimes they'd practice their craft on livestock. Records show that a few even trained their apprentices on pigs, since anatomically they were the closest thing to a human. A mildly horrifying but practical detail that medieval Europe specialized in. When business boomed, of course, there were times when things got busy. During plague years, uprisings, or moral panics, the hangman's calendar filled up quickly. He might perform multiple executions in a week or a day. Some cities had execution festivals, complete with audiences, vendors, and children, because medieval Europe never missed an opportunity for family entertainment. In those moments, the hangman transformed from a social outcast to a sort of grim celebrity. Crowds gathered, drums rolled, people craned their necks to see justice served, and then immediately crossed themselves, as if watching it made them complicit. And then, when the gallows were empty again, and the city's appetite for punishment was satisfied, he went back to his lonely tower to wait. The tools of his trade, executioners were often proud of their tools. In Germany, the sword was preferred for beheadings, a symbol of honor. Oddly enough, axes were considered cruder, more painful, and usually reserved for peasants, because even in death, class mattered. A skilled executioner could deliver a single, clean stroke, a mark of professional pride. A bad one might take several swings, and occasionally lose his job for inelegance. There are recorded cases of executioners being booed by the crowd for sloppy technique. Imagine being heckled at work by people eating pretzels. Dainku. Hangmen also kept a toolkit, knives for branding, ropes for hanging, tongs for other unpleasant tasks. He maintained everything meticulously, not for aesthetic reasons, but because faulty equipment could literally cause a riot. Nothing ruins an execution faster than an axe that doesn't quite get there. Odd perks of the profession. Now, strangely, the job had perks. For one, executioners were often paid quite well. They received wages, bonuses, and sometimes even the clothing or belongings of the condemned. In some places, They got the right to keep the rope or the blood, which, yes, people actually bought for medicinal use. Human fat, in particular, was considered therapeutic. It was believed to cure joint pain, swelling, and gout, so the hangman might, very discreetly, sell it to apothecaries. Again, a man who disposed of bodies could also turn a profit from them. It was the world's most disturbing recycling program. The hangman as a folk doctor by the 16th century. Some executioners had become respected, or at least tolerated, for their medical skills. Take Franz Schmidt, the most famous executioner in Nuremberg. He kept a diary of every execution he performed, over 350 in his lifetime, written with eerie precision. But in his spare time, he treated over 15,000 patients. He even received official permission from the city council to practice medicine. The hangman had become the healer. There's something oddly poetic in that. In fine, san fiorit andritit, a world obsessed with sin, blood, and purification. He was the man who literally cleaned up after everyone else, then helped them mend. A lonely honor, and yet he was never invited to dinner. No matter how good or gentle he was, society never forgave him for what he represented. At church, he sat in a separate pew. At markets, people stepped aside. If his shadow touched your bread, you were expected to throw it away. The irony is that executioners were often far more law-abiding than most nobles. They couldn't afford scandal. They had to stay sober, punctual and reliable, qualities not commonly found in medieval leadership. But still, no one wanted to be seen talking to them. They existed as living reminders that justice, like sausage, was something best not watched being made. Let's drift gently into the next section to explore how these men balanced their grim duties with ordinary life, and how some became unexpected symbols of mercy in a world that rarely knew what that meant. The irony of it all, what's strange, and perhaps a little poetic, is that some royal bastards ended up being far more competent, intelligent, or beloved than their legitimate half-siblings. William the Conqueror, as we saw, built a kingdom. Henry Fitzroy nearly became England's heir, and many more governed territories, led armies, or became indispensable advisors, because unlike the legitimate heirs, they had to earn their place. Their legitimacy was always questioned, their value never taken for granted, and so they worked harder, learned faster, and often lived longer, if they could avoid their family's affection for political murder. So that's where we'll pause for now. In our next stretch of the story, we'll drift deeper into the Renaissance and Baroque eras, where royal bastards became fashion accessories, political pawns, and sometimes the quiet founders of entire new dynasties. What did people eat in times of famine when there was nothing left? Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to the darker side of the dinner table. The sort of menu that, ideally, you'll never have to experience yourself. So get comfortable. Maybe grab a snack, ideally one that isn't bark or boiled shoe leather. Dim the lights. Let's take a slow walk through history's lean years. The famines that left entire kingdoms wondering what exactly counted as food. Because the truth is, famine wasn't rare. For most of human history, it was more common than abundance. The good harvests were temporary, fragile moments, but famine was dependable, predictable, as regular as winter. When the crops failed, when armies trampled the fields, when a summer frost turned grain to dust, people didn't just starve. They adapted, poorly, but creatively. And while that creativity produced a few grim innovations in culinary resilience, it mostly produced suffering, superstition, and the world's worst recipes. Let's start drifting, shall we? Let's begin in medieval Europe, because no one did suffering quite like the medieval peasantry. Imagine a village somewhere in 14th century England. It's late summer. The crops have failed, maybe because of too much rain or too little, or because the local lord decided to take your ox to pay for another war he's already losing. You've eaten through the stored grain, the beans, the turnips, and the pickled fish. Now you're left with, well, options. Not good ones, but options. Medieval people were nothing if not pragmatic when it came to survival. They turned first to what historians politely call famine foods, things that technically could be eaten but weren't designed for it. Things like bark, moss, and animal hides. Yes, bark bread was real. In places like Norway and Sweden, peasants would peel the inner layer of birch bark, not the rough outer part, but the soft, pale cambium layer underneath. They would dry it, grind it, and mix it with a little leftover flour, forming something that resembled bread only in the loosest possible sense. The result was a flat, grayish loaf that could technically keep you alive. It was filling if you didn't mind the taste of damp wood and mild despair. Some people claimed to enjoy it, though it's hard to tell if that was optimism or delirium. And then there was pottage, the medieval standby, a kind of eternal stew that simmered on the fire for days, weeks, or sometimes months. Normally it was a humble but hearty mix of grains, vegetables, and herbs. During a famine, though, that same pot might hold grass, weeds, roots, and whatever else could be boiled long enough to lose its identity. It's around this point that the record starts mentioning things like bread made from ground acorns and cakes of bran and dust. Some chroniclers in France noted that people even baked loaves from ground bones, mixed with a little meal to hold them together. If you're wondering how that tasted, well, one monk wrote simply that the bread was hard to swallow and without nourishment, which is medieval Latin for inedible. But famine didn't just change what people ate. It changed how they thought. When food vanished, so did the thin veneer of order. In the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, when relentless rain destroyed crops across northern Europe, there were stories of entire communities falling apart, parents abandoning children, priests refusing last rites because there were too many dying to keep up. And then there were the darker rumors, the ones about cannibalism. Chroniclers in England, France, and the Low Countries all mentioned it, though cautiously. They'd write things like, "There were reports that some ate human flesh," or "Desperate people sought sustenance in dreadful ways." Now, it's hard to know how true those stories were. Medieval writers loved a bit of moral horror, especially when describing peasants. But when people have eaten bark, rats, and boiled leather, it's not unreasonable to think that, yes, occasionally, something worse happened. There's one particularly grim note from the monastery of St. Albans, which recorded that children were stolen from their mothers' sides during the famine. That was in 1316, a year when the rain never seemed to stop. Grain prices tripled, livestock drowned in flooded fields, and people, quite literally, ran out of options. Even when famine ended, the psychological scars lingered. In some towns, people refused to throw away bones, hoarded crumbs, or became irrationally terrified of cloudy skies. Hunger had rewired them. Now, let's drift south to the Mediterranean, where things were at least seasoned. In ancient Rome, famine was less about failed crops and more about bad logistics. The empire was obsessed with grain, particularly Egyptian grain, which fed millions of citizens. When shipments were delayed, people panicked. Bread riots weren't just common. They were practically a seasonal event. During one shortage in the reign of Emperor Claudius, the crowd actually tried to stone him in the forum. Claudius, in true imperial fashion, handled it calmly, by running away and hiding in the palace until things improved. When the grain really ran out, Romans turned to old tricks, mixing ground beans, lentils, and even sawdust into bread dough. They also made a kind of emergency porridge called pulse, which could be thickened with whatever was lying around. Wild herbs, flower petals, even crushed leaves. Some desperate households made wine soup, where spoiled wine was boiled to kill the mold, then thickened with stale bread. It wasn't good, but it was something. And in cities like Rome or Alexandria, the poor sometimes resorted to eating the leftover grain husks used to feed animals. This was known as the sweepings, because it was literally what was swept up from granary floors. The wealthy, of course, fared better. They could flee to country estates or import food from their provinces. But even emperors weren't immune to famine politics. One rumor claimed that Emperor Nero himself caused shortages by buying up grain and storing it, just to sell it later at higher prices. A very Nero move. Whether that was true or not, the famine left its mark on Roman culture. Bread wasn't just food, it was political stability. The phrase panem et circenses, or bread and circuses, wasn't just poetic, it was policy. Over in ancient Egypt, famine had its own rhythm, tied to the flooding of the Nile. When the river rose too high or too low, harvests failed, and the land starved. The Egyptians personified famine as an angry goddess, a sign that something had gone wrong with the balance of the world. They tried to appease her with rituals, prayers, and, occasionally, accounting reforms. During the famous 7-year famine described in the famine stela, an inscription from the Ptolemaic period, Pharaoh Djoser supposedly consulted priests for advice. They told him to honor the god Khnum, who controlled the Nile's waters. Djoser agreed, made some generous temple donations, and according to the story, the floods returned. Historians suspect this was propaganda, a comforting myth from a later time, but it reflects how people made sense of hunger. Famine wasn't just bad luck, it was punishment, or imbalance, or the fault of a negligent ruler. Meanwhile, everyday Egyptians dealt with famine practically. They ate whatever grew wild, papyrus roots, lotus bulbs, palm pith, even mudfish caught in shrinking pools. Archaeologists have found grinding stones coated with traces of cattail pollen, a sign that people were literally turning pond plants into flour. It's hard to romanticize that, but it's also strangely human. That instinct to find something, anything, to chew on when the world has stopped providing. Let's drift forward a few centuries, to early modern Europe, where famine became both less common and somehow more tragic. By the 17th century, agriculture had improved just enough that famine wasn't inevitable, which made it even worse when it happened. Take the Great Famine of 1695–97, which swept through Scandinavia and the Baltics. In Sweden, entire villages starved. People resorted again to bark bread, but this time they had the brilliant idea to mix it with straw and lichen, producing what one witness described as a bread that could scarcely be swallowed without water. In Finland, the famine killed a third of the population. Government officials, writing from their well-stocked estates, noted with mild surprise that the peasants had begun eating grass and boiling the hides of beasts long dead. You can feel the detachment in their letters. For the educated classes, famine was an unfortunate natural disaster. For everyone else, it was a slow, shared undoing. And yet, even amid starvation, people kept records. Parish priests wrote down which foods people resorted to. Historians later turned those lists into something like a famine food index. It included tree bark, straw, moss, lichen, crushed pine cones, and, disturbingly often, cats and dogs. A few entries even mention meat of unknown origin, which, given the circumstances, is best left unexplored. It's easy to feel detached from these stories. They're far away, softened by time. But famine isn't just about hunger. It's about losing the rituals of eating, the comfort of the table, the sense that tomorrow there will be more. And that's why famine terrified people more than war or plague. It stripped away not just life, but the illusion of normalcy. It reminded them that civilization, all the bread and ale and laughter, was built on something as fragile as a harvest. In the next part, we'll drift deeper into how societies tried to prevent famine, often making it worse in the process, and how sometimes hunger turned ordinary people into reluctant heroes or accidental villains. How did ancient people deal with body odor before soap? Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a simpler, smellier time. A time before deodorant, before body wash, before even the vague comfort of a mint-scented wet wipe. We're going to talk about body odor, specifically how ancient people dealt with it before soap became a thing. Now, this may not sound like the most glamorous topic. It's not about kings or queens or heroic battles. But if you've ever sat next to someone on a hot bus in August, you already know. Human history is 50% about survival, and 50% about trying not to smell like survival. So go ahead, dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe light a candle, though preferably not one scented like 14th century Paris. And let's drift back to a world where people believed that dirt could be good for you. Let's begin. In ancient Mesopotamia, if you ever find yourself nostalgic for the dawn of civilization, don't. Ancient Mesopotamia, roughly 4,000 years ago, was hot, dusty, and full of people who hadn't yet invented personal space. Bathing wasn't unheard of, but it wasn't daily either. The earliest soaps were barely soaps at all, a sticky mixture of ash and animal fat. It got the job done, but it smelled a bit like disappointment and old mutton. Still, it worked, sort of. Babylonian tablets from around 2800 BCE mention this early soap-like substance used for cleaning wool and cloth, and sometimes people. So, congratulations to the ancient Babylonians. They were among the first to realize that being clean felt nice, even if it required rubbing lard and ashes on yourself. However, daily bathing? That was for the gods. Ordinary people were far too busy farming barley and inventing taxes. Most people in Mesopotamia probably cleaned themselves occasionally in the river, maybe used a bit of oil to scrape off dust, and then masked the rest with strong perfumes made of resin, cedar, or myrrh. In short, cleanliness wasn't next to godliness yet. It was somewhere closer to optional. The Egyptians, the original perfumers. Let's drift west, down the Nile, to where people took smell very seriously. These ancient Egyptians were the first civilization to treat body odor as a personal branding problem. They bathed daily, which already put them centuries ahead of almost everyone else. They used natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture, to scrub themselves clean. It worked as both a cleanser and deodorant. Of course, this was the same substance used to preserve mummies. So yes, their hygiene routine was basically a prelude to embalming. After washing, Egyptians coated themselves in perfumed oils, cinnamon, myrrh, frankincense, lotus, anything that could distract from the fact that the Nile smelled like, well, a river full of crocodiles and people. Even their clothes were perfumed. Some wealthier Egyptians wore scented wax cones on their heads during feasts. The idea being that, as the cone melted, it would release pleasant fragrance over time. In theory, this made you smell delightful. In practice, it meant you were sweating under a slowly liquefying blob of scented fat. But at least they were trying. The Egyptians cared deeply about cleanliness because they associated it with purity, order, and social status. A clean person was civilized. A dirty one was probably a foreigner, and in fairness, they weren't wrong to think it mattered. Living in a hot, dusty climate full of standing water and mosquitoes meant that cleanliness wasn't just vanity. It was basic disease prevention. So yes, they had their priorities in order. They couldn't cure the plague, but they could die smelling nice. Grease. Olive oil and athletic funk next. Let's float gently into ancient Greece. Land of philosophers, marble statues, and surprisingly greasy hygiene practices. The Greeks didn't use soap. Instead, they bathed with oil. They would slather their skin in olive oil, then scrape it off with a curved metal tool called a strigil. This removed sweat, dirt, and dead skin, leaving the user technically cleaner, but also slightly marinated. Athletes did this constantly. After a workout, a Greek wrestler might scrape the collected mixture of oil, sweat, and dust off his body, and then sell it to admirers as a tonic. Because, of course, he did. The product, charmingly called gloios, was believed to have magical and medicinal properties. It was, to put it gently, vintage body goo. Now, this wasn't entirely ridiculous. Olive oil does help moisturize the skin, but it also traps heat and dust. So most people probably spent the day smelling like a salad left in the sun. Still, to the Greeks, the oily sheen symbolized health and vigor. Soap was for laundry. Oil was for people. And if your body odor became too heroic, there was always perfume. They loved strong scents, made from herbs, resins, and flowers steeped in oil. Everyone from philosophers to prostitutes had their signature fragrances, which makes you wonder how Socrates' students ever concentrated in class. Rome. When bathing became a social event, if the Greeks were a little greasy, the Romans were downright enthusiastic about getting wet. By the 1st century CE, Rome was obsessed with bathing. Public bathhouses were everywhere. Enormous, steamy palaces of marble, mosaics, and occasionally very bad plumbing decisions. A typical Roman bathing routine involved multiple stages. First, undress. Then, oil yourself. Scrape with a strigil. Soak in the warm pool. Tepidarium. Then move to the hot one, caldarium. And finally, cool down in the frigidarium. This entire process could take hours. It was equal parts hygiene, gossip, and politics. Of course, clean is a relative term. Most bathwater was communal. Hundreds of Romans shared the same pools daily, which made the water something of a biological soup. But the Romans didn't mind. They also used early versions of soaps made from animal fats and ashes, imported from the Gauls, who, ironically, were considered barbarians. So yes, the Romans borrowed hygiene tips from the people they conquered. They applied perfumes liberally to their hair, their clothes, even their pets. Some wealthy citizens reportedly had slaves whose only job was to perfume their feet, because of course they did. In Roman culture, smelling pleasant was a sign of luxury and status. But smelling, too, pleasant was considered vain or effeminate, so everyone walked a delicate line between refined citizen and walking myrrh, candle. The Middle Ages, a misunderstood stink, and now let's glide gently into the Middle Ages, a time period unfairly blamed for every bad smell in history. You've probably heard the myth that medieval Europeans never bathed. It's not true, at least not entirely. In fact, people bathed more often than we assume. Public bathhouses were common across Europe from the 12th to 15th centuries. Some even offered warm water, soap made from animal fat, and herbal oils. But, and there's always a but, bathhouses gradually gained a rather scandalous reputation. They became centers of gossip, illicit meetings, and occasionally prostitution. So when the church decided that naked communal relaxation wasn't very godly, bathing fell out of favor. By the 16th century, doctors had also started warning that bathing could open the pores and allow disease to enter the body, which, given medieval medicine's track record, was perfectly on brand. So people adapted. Instead of washing, they changed their linen shirts frequently. The idea was that the clean fabric would absorb the dirt and sweat. In other words, laundry replaced bathing. They also masked smells with perfume, lavender, rose water, ambergris, musk. The more expensive, the better. If you couldn't actually be clean, you could at least smell rich. And that's really the theme of medieval hygiene. A constant battle between superstition, class, and the limits of plumbing. Let's pause on the concept of smelling rich. In most ancient and medieval societies, scent was class. The poor smelled of work, sweat, smoke, livestock, and desperation. The wealthy smelled like imported resin, honey, and rose petals steeped in wine. There was a whole olfactory hierarchy. Kings and nobles often employed professional perfumers. Queen Elizabeth Thursters, for example, was said to bathe once a month, whether she needed it or not, and kept her gloves perfumed with ambergris and civet. Meanwhile, her subjects were told that bathing was dangerous. Naturally, they made it worse by sealing themselves into layers of unwashed clothing, trapping every odor in a humid little ecosystem of fabric. Still, they believed it was healthier. Smells were thought to carry disease. So covering bad ones with good ones seemed like self-defense. Perfume was medicine, and, as with all medicine of the time, it didn't work. But let's drift back to simpler, stinkier times before any of that. Before Rome and Greece and royal perfumes, human beings had to survive their own smell. Prehistoric people probably didn't care much. They lived outdoors, near fires, constantly moving. Sweat was part of life, and natural oils protected their skin. But as humans built cities, started crowding together, and invented the concept of neighbors, suddenly, smell mattered. It became social currency. You could tell someone's job, class, even nationality, by their scent. So as you drift off tonight, remember, every ancient person you've ever studied, from the noblest pharaoh to the humblest peasant, was at some point standing in the heat, wondering why everyone smelled faintly of onions and sheep. And, in a way, that's comforting, because it means that despite thousands of years of progress, humanity's been asking the same quiet question forever. How do I not smell like this? The forgotten children of kings, hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a quieter corner of royal history. Not the glittering coronations, or the grand battles, or the portraits, where everyone looks vaguely constipated with importance. Tonight's story is about the ones history mostly tried to ignore. The royal bastards. The children of kings, born to women who weren't supposed to exist. They were whispered about, recorded in half-sentences, or simply erased altogether, and yet, every so often, one of them survived childhood. And that's where the story gets interesting, and a little sad. So, get comfortable. Dim the lights. Maybe wrap yourself in something soft. Because this one's not about bloodshed or betrayal. Well, not only that. It's about all the royal children who began life on the wrong side of the blanket, and somehow managed to live long enough to become someone's problem. Born of kings, denied by them. Let's start by acknowledging the obvious. Royalty, for all their rules about virtue and purity, were terrible at following them. From the moment monarchs realized that having power meant never hearing the word no, illegitimate children became an inevitable byproduct of dynastic life. Kings had wives for politics, mistresses for pleasure, and priests for forgiveness. The result was a trail of children scattered across Europe, each one inconveniently reminding everyone that the king was, in fact, human. Now, in theory, most of these children weren't supposed to survive. Not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, administrative one. The church frowned upon them. The crown ignored them, and the law politely pretended they didn't exist. But every so often, a royal bastard would live long enough to start asking questions like, "Why does that man on the coin have my face?" And that was when things got complicated. England, where bastards had branding. England, naturally, had a very organized approach to illegitimacy, mostly because they had so much of it. Let's start with William the Conqueror, or, as his contemporaries called him, William the Bastard. Yes, that was his actual nickname. Imagine conquering all of England and still not being able to shake off your childhood insult. William was born in Normandy, the illegitimate son of Duke Robert III and a woman named Herleva, the daughter of a tanner. So, not only was he illegitimate, he was working-class illegitimate. For medieval nobles, that was basically 2 strikes. Yet somehow, little William survived every assassination attempt aimed at reminding him of his status. By age 7, he'd outlived most of his tutors. By 38, he'd conquered England, and for the rest of his reign, every noble who resented him, which was all of them, still whispered that he was the bastard duke. And so began a long, proud English tradition. Royal bastards could do anything they wanted, except be treated like they belonged. The Plantagenets, a family that couldn't stop multiplying. If William set the precedent, the Plantagenets perfected it. Take Henry II, for instance, husband to Eleanor of Aquitaine, father of Richard the Lionheart, and King John, and by most accounts, a man who saw marriage, vows as vague suggestions. Henry fathered at least a dozen illegitimate children, and those are just the ones historians can confirm. He was generous with them in a way. He gave them land, titles, and sometimes entire regions to govern, but always with a catch. A royal bastard could be wealthy, but never royal, powerful, but never safe, and loved only when politically convenient. One of Henry's illegitimate sons, Geoffrey, became the Archbishop of York, a curious career choice for someone born of sin, but very on brand for medieval church politics. He spent most of his life fighting with his legitimate half-brothers, who took turns exiling and forgiving him, depending on the family drama of the week. By the time Geoffrey died, he'd been accused of treason twice, stripped of his offices, and reinstated by the Pope. A sort of religious yo-yo, suspended between privilege and punishment. That was the fate of many royal bastards in medieval England. Not quite noble, not quite common, a constant reminder of the king's mistakes, and, inconveniently, of his ability to reproduce. The Tudors. Branding the bastard fast forward to the Tudors, a dynasty that loved nothing more than denying the existence of its own origins. Henry VII, founder of the line, claimed legitimacy through his mother's cousin's marriage contract, which is already a bad sign. But it was his son, Henry V, who truly turned illegitimacy into a national pastime. Now, Henry VIII had several acknowledged illegitimate children, the most famous being Henry Fitzroy. The name literally means son of the king, which was either charmingly honest or mildly cruel, depending on how you look at it. Fitzroy's mother was Bessie Blount, one of Henry's early mistresses. The king adored his illegitimate son, largely because he looked like him, which in Henry's mind was the highest compliment a person could receive. He gave Fitzroy a ducal title, Duke of Richmond, and set him up in his own household, complete with servants, tutors, and enough wealth to make legitimate nobles uncomfortable. For a brief, ridiculous moment, Henry even considered legitimizing Fitzroy and naming him heir to the throne. Because naturally, the man married 6 women, and still thought his best option might be the one who wasn't supposed to exist. But Fitzroy died young, 17, probably of tuberculosis, and with him died Henry's fleeting affection for paternal sentiment. After that, the king largely ignored his other illegitimate offspring. When a man orders the execution of 2 wives and a cardinal, sentimental consistency isn't really his strong suit. Let's drift across the channel. France. If England produced bastards by accident, France did it on purpose. French kings had official mistresses. They were known, quite respectfully, as the maîtresse en titre, which sounds elegant, but really just means the one everyone pretends, isn't married to the king. And with official mistresses came official illegitimate children. Louis XIV, the son, king, had more illegitimate children than some. Villages had taxpayers, acknowledged many of them, legitimized a few, and arranged marriages for several. A few even received noble titles, because when you rule by divine right, paperwork is just a formality. But even these royal bastards lived in a peculiar limbo. They were not entirely excluded. They could live in palaces, attend court, and enjoy endless luxury. Yet they were never quite permitted to forget their origins. No matter how fine their clothes or polished their manners, they were always the reminders. The daughters were married off to loyal courtiers. The sons were sent into the military or the church, depending on temperament. One of Louis's sons, the Duke of Maine, was even considered as a possible regent after the king's death. But the legitimate princes naturally blocked him, because for all their piety and powdered wigs, the French nobility had an excellent memory when it came to scandal. Tando Tinturn. Note on survival. Let's pause here, because the real miracle isn't that royal bastards existed, it's that any of them survived childhood at all. Illegitimate. Children weren't always given the best care, especially if their mothers were quietly removed from court after their usefulness ended. Some were fostered out to monasteries or to sympathetic noble families. Others were hidden entirely to avoid political embarrassment. In many cases, their existence was only confirmed decades later, when they appeared in royal records as adults, receiving land or a pension, like ghosts suddenly stepping out of the margins of history. It's strange. Really, kings would go to absurd lengths to erase these children, yet just as often, they'd bring them back later, usually when it suited them. A bastard was a secret until he was useful. Then he became family. Scotland. The practical approach, Scotland, handled bastards differently, mainly because everyone there had bigger problems. The Scottish crown wasn't nearly as squeamish about illegitimacy. If a king had an illegitimate child, and that child could hold a sword, he was useful. That was pretty much the end of the discussion. Take Robert the Bruce. He had several illegitimate children, and instead of hiding them, he gave them jobs, governorships, lands, military commands. It wasn't moral. It was efficient. Even centuries later, Scottish nobles often traced descent from royal bastards without shame. Illegitimacy was less of a stain and more of an asterisk, an extra line on the family tree, rather than a mark of disgrace. It helped that Scotland didn't have the same rigid class obsession as France or England. When your kingdom is perpetually at war with either England or itself, nobody cares if your great-grandfather's marriage certificate was missing. The double standard, of course. Royal bastards were always male in the public imagination, or at least only the male ones were ever mentioned. Female illegitimate children were usually married off quietly to lesser nobles or clergy members, with generous dowries and no publicity. If they were particularly beautiful or well-connected, they might find themselves repeating their mother's stories as mistresses to other powerful men. The cycle continued, quietly, for centuries. Men inherited scandal and turned it into power. Women inherited it and tried to survive it. And when they were lucky, very lucky, they became the half-forgotten ancestresses of future dynasties. A few drops of royal blood running quietly through history, never quite acknowledged, never quite denied. What happened to royal mistresses when they got old? The fading glitter of power. Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to the quieter corners of royal history. Not to the grand coronations or glittering banquets, but to the rooms that grew very quiet afterwards. So, find somewhere comfortable. Dim the lights, and let's talk about what happened when the royal mistresses got old. Because for centuries, being the king's favorite woman, and yes, that was the actual title, was one of the strangest jobs in the world. It came with jewels, power, influence, and the occasional beheading. It also came with an expiration date. A royal mistress, after all, was a position built entirely on youth, charm, and proximity to one man's wandering attention span. And when that attention moved on, well, let's just say there were no pensions. Let's start in France. Because if there was ever a country that perfected the art of the mistress, it was France. By the time of the Bourbon kings, the royal mistress wasn't just a scandalous rumor. She was practically a government position. They had official apartments, state funds, and sometimes even staff. The French called them maîtresse en titre, which literally means mistress in title. And yes, that was printed in ledgers. But court life is like gravity. What goes up must eventually fall into quiet obscurity. Madame de Montespan. The glorious fall take Madame de Montespan, for instance, the golden mistress of King Louis XIV. She began as everything a royal mistress was supposed to be. Beautiful, witty, and just a little bit terrifying. She had 7 children by the king, lived in magnificent apartments at Versailles, and threw lavish parties full of powdered wigs and philosophical gossip. She was called the true Queen of France, which was, technically incorrect, but emotionally accurate. Unfortunately, there's a problem with being the most desirable woman at court. Someone younger always shows up. In Montespan's case, it was Madame de Maintenon, her children's governess, which is a particularly unpleasant twist of fate. It's one thing to be replaced by a glamorous rival. It's quite another to be replaced by the woman folding your royal baby's laundry. When Louise's attention shifted, Montespan tried everything to win it back. More jewels, more wit, more displays of affection. But by then, the Sun King's interest had dimmed, and then came the final blow. The affair of the poisons, a sprawling scandal involving fortune-tellers, love potions, and quite a lot of accidental deaths. Montespan was implicated, rumored to have bought magic charms to keep Louis faithful. She denied it, of course, but the damage was done. The most powerful woman in France suddenly found herself politely excluded. She retired to a convent, as many discarded mistresses did, not because she was devout, though she tried very hard to appear so, but because there was nowhere else for her to go. Versailles did not have an exit plan for women, who had once been the center of the king's world. She spent the rest of her life in quiet repentance, or as quiet as you can be when you arrive with 20 servants and a cartload of silverware. She died in 1707, aged 66. Her obituary was simple. Madame de Montespan is dead, and with her, an age. Let's drift over to England, where the story isn't so much different, just more Protestant and slightly less subtle. Nell Gwynn, the mistress with charm, the Restoration court of Charles II, was a haze of powdered wigs, spaniels, and scandal. And among the many women who shared the king's favor, Nell Gwynn was the most beloved. She started out selling oranges in the London theatre, then moved on stage herself. She was funny, earthy, and, most importantly, knew how to make Charles laugh. Unlike the others, Nell never took herself too seriously. When her coach was attacked by an angry mob, mistaking her for one of the king's less popular mistresses, she famously leaned out the window and shouted, "Pray, good people, be civil. I am the Protestant whore," which worked. The crowd cheered, and Nell rode on. But time, as always, keeps its own counsel. By the time Charles died in 1685, Nell had already been pushed to the edges of court life. She received a small house and a royal pension to support herself and her son, who, of course, was also a royal bastard. When she died just 2 years later, aged 37, she was buried quietly, the merriest mistress of the merry monarch, fading away into London fog. The convents and country estates of Europe's forgotten women. Most royal mistresses didn't get Nell's charm or Montespan's luxury. Their retirements tended to fall into 2 categories, convent or countryside. If you were lucky, the king would give you an estate somewhere quiet, with just enough income to keep you from writing memoirs. If you weren't, you were packed off to a nunnery, often against your will. The reasoning was simple. 8. Retired mistress wandering around society was a political liability. A retired mistress behind convent walls was an elegant solution. The 17th century Italian court of Parma once saw 3 of its former mistresses living in the same convent. Apparently, they did not get along. Aging in a world that worshipped youth at court. Aging wasn't just inconvenient. It was almost obscene. Your beauty, your wit, your very presence were political assets, and once they faded, so did your social oxygen. You could feel the temperature drop as younger, fresher faces appeared in the ballroom. Aged mistresses became ghosts, haunting their former apartments, or cautionary tales whispered behind fans. She once had the king's ear, they'd say, and now she can't even get an invitation. they tried to adapt. Some turned religious, some bitter, some philosophical. Madame de Barry, for example, Louis XV's final mistress, tried to live gracefully after his death. She donated to charities, took up gardening, and practiced diplomacy with her enemies. Unfortunately, she lived long enough to see the French Revolution, and when that came, the former mistress of a king was not a popular figure. She was executed by guillotine in 1793, begging for her life, which, by the grim standards of the time, made her one of the lucky ones. At least she got a full trial. The cruel irony, the irony of the royal mistress's life, is that she often wielded more power than queens, but none of the permanence. She could influence wars, appointments, even treaties. But her legacy depended entirely on the whims of one man, and the short shelf life of beauty in a court that measured everything in appearances. It's strange to think that some of the most powerful women in early modern Europe ended their lives quietly, embroidering in a convent parlor, or living in exile with nothing but memories of velvet corridors and candlelit dinners. Yet there's something oddly peaceful about it, too, because for the first time they were beyond the politics of beauty. The court had forgotten them, and they, in turn, could finally forget the court. Let's drift, now, to another kind of mistress. Not the official ones, with titles and diamonds, but the hidden ones. The women who never quite made it into the history books because they were never meant to. By the late Middle Ages, even the church was growing weary of miracles. They were too messy, too easy to fake, and too often used to line someone's pockets. So the standards got higher. Miracles now required witnesses, written testimony, and sometimes medical verification. But that didn't stop people from trying. A 15th century manual for inquisitors even included a section titled, "How to Distinguish a True Miracle from a False One." It's a fascinating read, though most of the advice boils down to, if it seems too convenient, it probably is, good advice in any century. And yet, for all the fraud, the longing for miracles never faded, because behind every dripping statue and glowing relic was something heartbreakingly human, the need to feel seen by the divine. The Weeping Virgin wasn't just a trick. It was a mirror of the people watching her. Their fears, their grief, their hope that the heavens might still intervene in the muddy chaos of their lives. Whether fake or real, almost, didn't matter. It was enough that, for a moment, the crowd could believe. So, as we drift toward the next part of our story, imagine that candlelit chapel, the murmuring crowd, the faint shimmer of something that might be a miracle, or might just be clever plumbing, and somewhere in the back, a monk with a small hammer, giving it just the right tap at just the right time. From herbal tonics and astrological cures, to the rise of the first true madhouses, Because if the Middle Ages began by blaming demons, they ended by discovering something almost as terrifying: the human mind itself. Many endured it with patience, a few with resentment, and a rare handful with genuine affection. But all understood what was at stake. Heirs meant security. No heirs meant trouble. Night. The silence between centuries, and so the day ended. Quietly, ritualistically, indistinguishably from the one before it. Days blended into seasons, seasons into years. A queen's life was measured less by experiences than by events. Coronations, births, deaths, treaties. Between those, there was embroidery, prayer, and waiting. Waiting to be called, to be needed, to be remembered. Waiting for a husband's messenger, or a child's tutor, or a political decision made by men elsewhere. It was, in many ways, a life of almost unbearable stillness, surrounded by gold and ceremony, yet starved of freedom. Not the poisonings or the marriages, or the betrayals, though there were plenty of those, but the sheer, endless monotony of royal existence,